All right. Welcome, everybody, to tonight's presentation by Tyler Tichelaar. My name's Marty Ackitts, and I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator for Peter White Public Library. And I just have a group that I need to thank, the Friends of Peter White Public Library, who provide all of the equipment for our live streaming. So if you are watching on YouTube right now or after the fact, you can thank the Friends of Peter White Public Library because they provide tons and tons of really wonderful resources for us to draw from. Just a couple things upcoming this week that I want to make you aware of. On Friday, downstairs in the community room, if you want popcorn and a movie, you can come at noon to see Are You There, Margaret? Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, the film adaptation of Judy Blume's book. Starts at noon. There will be popcorn. And then on Saturday, if you are a big horror movie fan, we are having the Carnival of Horrors. Yes, thank you. I was going to say Carnival of Blood, but that's a movie. The Carnival of Horrors. It starts at 10 a.m. Downstairs in the community room, and we're going to be showing three classic horror films, comedy films, sort of. The first one's going to be Beetlejuice. The second one will be Poltergeist. And then the third one will be Scream. There's going to be a costume contest and also Halloween trivia. So you can win some prizes if you show up on that day. Lots of great stuff coming up for the rest of this week. I'm going to just do a little introduction. I've known Tyler for, 30 years. Yeah, we went to school together at Northern, went to school together down at Western. I remember when Tyler was thinking of coming to Western, he came and stayed at my apartment, and we had a great weekend. I showed him around. Tyler's been a great friend over the years. I'm really thankful that he's here tonight to do this presentation for us. So let me just tell you a little bit about Tyler. Most of the people in this room know Tyler, but people watching may not. So Tyler Tichelaar has a PhD in literature from Western Michigan University and a bachelor and master's degree in English from Northern Michigan University. And he's the owner of Marquette Fiction, his own publishing company, Superior Book Productions, a professional editing and proofreading, book layout, and website design and maintenance service. And he is the former president of the UP Publishers and Authors Association. And he's also considered a local expert on Marquette history and is proud to be a seventh-generation Marquette resident. Tyler has published, we were just talking before the event began, has published a lot. Most authors are happy if they have 4 books on their resume. Tyler has 20 books on his resume, which is amazing. And I was just looking through these publication dates of the list of books that he has, and for a while there was like almost one a year. That's crazy, that kind of output. As a poet, I can imagine writing a poem a year, but not an entire book a year. So that's pretty amazing. I'm not going to go through all of the books that Tyler has published, but I'm going to go through his most recent books. In 2017, he published Haunted Marquette. In 2018, he published When Teddy Came to Town. This is one a year. In 2019, he published the Nomad Editor. In 2020, he published Kabagum, The Chief, The Legend, The Man. In 2023, you took a break there. You did. In 2023, he published the book that he's going to be talking about tonight in the subject matter, Vampire Grooms and Spectre Brides. And also this year, he just published in July, Odin's Eye, a Marquette time travel novel. So please welcome to Peter White Public Library, Tyler Tichelaar.
Thank you, Marty. Tonight I'm going to talk about the history of Gothic fiction. And as you can tell by my costume, I love Gothic literature. I was Dracula as a kid for Halloween, had a Weeble's haunted house to play with, would do things like say bloody murder 1,000 times staring in the mirror, trying not to blink my eyes because then supposedly the devil would show up. He never did. It never happened for me. But I've always just been obsessed with scary books and literature. And So I'm going to just talk about the history of Gothic fiction tonight, starting out with its origins and bringing it up to the present, mostly focusing on like 19th century classic texts, but a little bit beyond that. So, and that photo there is Bran Castle in Romania, and also, I don't know if you can see my shirt, I have Bran Castle on it. I actually have been to Romania, to Dracula-related places. Actually, the truth of the matter is that Dracula is supposedly based on Vlad Tepes, and Vlad has a very loose connection to this castle, but when all the tourists started going to Romania, out of interest for Dracula, the Romanians decided, well, we need to get a castle associated with Dracula to make the tourists happy, so hence the castle has become famous. So, Gothic literature actually begins in 1764 with this man here, Horace Walpole. He was the son of Robert Walpole, who was a prime minister of England. And he was very interested in all things sort of antiquarian, medieval Gothic. And so he wrote his book, The Casa of Otranto, which is set in Italy. And it has in it, it's a very short book. Some people think it's just kind of a parody, but it is a very short novel, about 100 pages long, but it has basically all the major Gothic elements that would be used throughout Gothic literature into the future, starting out with the castle or a medieval building like a convent, a monastery, supposedly a building that is haunted. And then there are all kinds of subplots in the novel relating to incest, relating to who has the right to inherit the castle. There's a literary critic who has said Gothic plots are family plots, and that's the case in this book. Is the owner of the castle really the owner of the castle? And they go back a few generations and find an heir to the earlier owners of the castle, and so there's a debate over the ownership of the castle. And primogeniture, inheritance, all of those kinds of things are involved. Plus, winding passages and people being chased down winding passages and possibilities of ghosts. So just lots of original Gothic elements. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. How Horace Walpole actually built a house called Strawberry Hill, which is the house over the far, your left. And a lot of the passages in the Casa of Otranto, if you read them, they seem like they're descriptions of passages in his house. And so he built this elaborate home, which is supposed to look Gothic. It's kind of a fake medieval Gothic look. It is now open to the public, has been for about 15 years, so you can actually go there and tour it. And the rise of the Gothic novel happens at about the same time as this interest in medieval literature, medieval architecture, and so a lot of people are trying to have these medieval revival. And so another Gothic author is William Beckford, who built this house, Fonthill Abbey, which is not there anymore. The tower actually fell down. But he was the author of Vathek, which was published in 1786, which is a Gothic novel set in what he would have called the Orient, but we would call the Middle East, like Arabia. And so you have a lot of interest in these sort of pseudo-Gothic structures, a lot of interest in abbeys that are not there anymore, but they're making new abbeys or building fake-looking castles. And just a lot of interest in antiquarianism, digging up the past and going back to the Middle Ages and sort of remodeling that for themselves. So here's just a list of some of the elements of Gothic fiction. So like I said, typically you have a Gothic setting, like a castle, a mansion, a forest, a monastery, or a convent, a crypt. All of those usually, at least one of those is usually in a Gothic novel. You have supernatural events. Sometimes they are real. Sometimes they are just the fears of the person thinking something has happened. Sometimes they are intentionally fake, and there's like somebody manipulating things to scare other people in the novel. So you have lots of fear and suspense. You have family secrets. Like I said, Gothic plots are family plots. A lot of the time, family secrets are revealed through manuscripts that are discovered, where, maybe grandpa left this manuscript and it tells, how he has this illegitimate child who turns out to be a major character in the plot, something like that. Lots of heightened emotions: anger, hate, revenge, passion, romance, greed, lust, murder, physical violence or the threat of it. So a lot of time you have cases where people are locked up or imprisoned, or they are being tortured, or they're threatened with being tortured or raped, something like that. So there's a reason to fear bodily harm. Emotional or psychological abuse, transgression, which is a fancy word for sin, basically, but it's committing a crime or a sin, and it could be against society, religion, God. So I'll talk a little bit more about that one in a minute. Death and morbidity, just kind of this melancholy and decay, and there's lots of graveyard scenes. And then stories within stories. That's one of my favorite aspects of it. The Arabian Nights was translated into French and then into English in the mid-1700s, and that really inspired the Gothic. So it was being discovered about the same time the Gothic novel was starting. And so they used the Arabian Nights format, where there would be a story, and then within the story would be another story, and with that story there would be yet another story, and then eventually you come back out of the stories. So it gets very complicated, and often they're first-person narrations with other first-person narrations inside of them. And then you basically have villains who are seeking power or a way to transcend the natural world, or sometimes they're villains who have sought power and now regret it and are just have a lot of guilt in them and need redemption. And so the first Gothic novel was published in 1764, but the Gothic didn't really catch on until the 1790s because of this event, the French Revolution. And if you remember that list I just had about transgression against God, society, the French Revolution was the ultimate transgression in the eyes of people at the time because it was overthrowing the monarchy. They believed that the king was chosen by God, divine right of kings. And so if you are going to kill the king or just overthrow the king, you are acting against God's preordained sense of order, the hierarchy of things. So it's a crime against the king is a crime against God. And so all these Gothic novels that come out in the 1790s really are in many ways metaphorically reacting to that. And they may not have a king in them, but often there will be a crime against a family or against the patriarchy, reactions against the patriarchy. There'll be a father who, maybe is trying to force his daughter to marry someone, and she refuses and she elopes with somebody else. And so that's seen as a transgression against the patriarchy because she's disobeying her father. Or a lot of the time there are characters who are higher up the ladder, like a marquis or a count, and they have, for example, one of them, The Romance of the Forest, the count has this illegitimate daughter. He doesn't know she's his daughter. He almost ends up raping her, and so it's incest, but it's all about the social order being disrupted because of these transgressions that are taking place. And so that really fuels the Gothic novel. Even though the French Revolution takes place in France, it fuels the Gothic novel in England because the English are very concerned about the same thing happening in England, a revolution similar to the French one. And the star of the Gothic novel at that time is Anne Radcliffe, known to her readers at the time as Mrs. Radcliffe. And she wrote 6 Gothic novels, the most famous of which is probably The Mysteries of Udolpho in 1794, and that one is definitely my favorite one. Mrs. Radcliffe is famous today because she always had to explain her supernatural events. So the characters think there are ghosts, but in the end, there's some explanation for what they saw that they thought was a ghost. It was actually realistic, not supernatural. And so all the plots are usually resolved happily. There's usually a young woman involved who has to undergo all these troubles, and then in the end, she ends up happily married. So, for example, in The Mysteries of Udolpho, Emily St. Aubert is the main character. She has a father who is elderly, and he becomes ill and is going to die, and he asks her before he dies to destroy certain papers without looking at them, and she goes to destroy them. But of course, she glances at something, and she sees something that alarms her, but she destroys them anyway, so she's not really sure, if there's a family secret, and she decides she's not going to keep reading, so she just destroys it. She's also in love with a young man named Valancourt, who, now that her father has died, she ends up being the ward of her aunt. Her aunt doesn't think Valancourt is high enough in society for her, and the aunt then marries this Italian nobleman named Montoni, and they go off to Italy to his castle Udolpho and take Emily with them. And Montoni ends up to be this horrible, villainous man in charge of all these bandits, the banditti, who are in lots of Italian Gothic novels. And so he's involved in all these shifty criminal activities in Italy. And the only reason he married Emily's aunt was for her money, so he basically makes her life a living hell until she dies, and then he gets the money. And meanwhile, Emily is basically imprisoned in the castle. At one point, she thinks Valancourt is a prisoner in the castle. She thinks he's coming to save her. He never does come and save her. With the help of two of the servants, she finally escapes from the castle. But before she does that, there's also a room with this mysterious object in it. There's this veil hanging over something, and no one knows what's behind the veil. Finally, she's brave enough to pull aside the veil and look at it, and she faints when she sees it. And then Mrs. Radcliffe goes on for like 300 pages before she tells us what the secret behind the veil was, which turns out to be this horrendous statue of this man with all these like bloody holes in him. And it was used as a form of penance by the owner of the castle, who had to sit there and stare at this horrible thing and contemplate death as his penance for his sins. So she thinks there's ghosts in the castle and all this other stuff, but in the end, everything is explained. And in the end, she gets to be with Valancourt, who is really kind of a useless character and not really much of a hero at all. The Mysteries of Udolpho, like I said, that was her most popular book. And before she wrote the Italian, this man, Matthew Lewis, came along and wrote another novel called The Monk, which I guess I forgot to put the name of the book there. But he wrote this novel called The Monk, and this is the cover of an edition of The Monk. You can see the monk up there. Well, one of my friends, I love The Monk. I thought it was a riot, but one of my friends then read it, and she was like, yeah, it should have been called Sex Monk, because that's basically what the monk does. He falls in love with this nun, who, by the end of the novel, we find out is actually Satan, come to tempt him. And what Matthew Lewis does that's different than Mrs. Radcliffe is, the nun is actually Satan. She is not, it's not like he's imagining she's Satan, she really is Satan. The supernatural in the novel is actually real. It's not just explained away like Mrs. Radcliffe. Mrs. Radcliffe is coming out of the 18th century sort of idea of the Enlightenment and, rationalism. And he's going back to more supernatural, medieval superstition kind of stuff. The other really interesting thing about The Monk is it introduces the character of the wandering Jew. And that is like one of the stories within a story. There's another character, a minor character in the book, who meets up with, he's haunted by the bleeding nun, and she's like his great aunt, and usually there's a lot of that family plot stuff, like there's some secret in the family past. And so to be relieved from being haunted by the bleeding nun, the wandering Jew shows up to get the bleeding nun to go into the light, so to speak. The wandering Jew, he has the mark on his forehead, a cross like the mark of Cain, and he is today we would probably consider him not politically correct character, but he is supposed to personify the Jewish people, and they're being exiled from Israel, and they're having to wander the earth and wait for Christ's second coming. And the wandering Jew himself specifically was a shoemaker in most versions of the legend who had a house on the road to Calvary, and Jesus asked, as he was carrying his cross, if he could stop and rest on the wandering Jew's bench, and the wandering Jew said, "No, keep moving." And Jesus said, "Okay, but you're going to have to keep moving until I come back." And so the wandering Jew is cursed for the rest of time. By the time he shows up in the monk, he's like trying to help people out. He's trying to redeem himself. And there are many either wandering Jews who show up in other novels or characters very much based on the wandering Jew who are immortals, who are cursed by their immortality. So after that novel came out, Mrs. Radcliffe wrote The Italian, which was kind of in response to this one, where again, she basically explains away all the supernatural. And she also has an evil monk who, I think he's a priest technically, but named Shadoni, who has an illegitimate daughter who he almost ends up murdering at one point, not realizing that she's his daughter. But it's a kind of written as a response to the monk. And then we come to Jane Austen, who wrote Northanger Abbey in 1818. She's better known for her, novels of manners like Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility. But Northanger Abbey was sort of her spoof on Gothic literature. This character here is Catherine Morland, the main character, reading a Gothic novel. And in the novel, Catherine and her friend Isabella, they love Gothic novels. They just can't get enough of Gothic novels. And it affects their minds to the point where they think everything around them is a Gothic plot. And so Catherine meets this gentleman, Henry Tilney, who invites her to his house. And she's convinced that his father murdered his mother by the time she leaves the house. And Jane Austen, like Mrs. Radcliffe, in the end, she explains it all away. And Henry Tilney says, this is England in the 1800s. We're reasonable, rational people. These kinds of things don't happen in England, you silly girl. And she marries him anyway. But in Northanger Abbey, there is a list of several Gothic novels that the characters read. And this is the list of them, the Northanger novels, they're called today. And for many years, scholars thought that all these novels were just made up by Jane Austen, other than the references to Mrs. Radcliffe, because Isabella and Catherine are very concerned about what is behind that veil in the Castle of Udolpho. In the novel, they're reading The Mysteries of Udolpho, but they also read all these other books. Isabella shows up one day with this list of these books, and she lists them off, and Catherine says, "But are they all horrid? Are you sure they're all horrid?" And Isabella insists, yes, they are, and it'll take us quite some time to get through all of them. Some of them, like Horrid Mysteries and The Necromancer, were actually German novels that were then translated into English, quite often with the English translator's name on them rather than the German authors, kind of like piracy in its day. But a lot of the books the Germans and the French were also writing their own Gothic novels by this point, and a lot of those are being translated into English. I have read all of those, and I can say they're all pretty horrid, scary. Other than Horrid Mysteries, which is a pretty horrid book, it's just not a good book. So you can skip that one. At the same time, we have an interest in Gothic art, and this famous painting, The Nightmare, by Henry Fuseli, is often cited as an example of interest in Gothic art. The title probably reflects not just that this woman is having a nightmare, but also the horse is a mare. So there's a play on words there. He is the creature on her chest is an incubus, which supposedly brings terrible dreams. And this painting is actually in the Detroit Institute of Arts, the original, if you want to go see it. I've been there twice trying to see this painting, and both times that gallery has been closed off when I was there. So someday I'll get there. And then we come to a very famous event in 1816 at the Villa Diodati in Italy. It was known as the year without a summer. It was a very cold summer. And so these famous authors all gathered there before most of them were really famous. But Percy Shelley was in love with Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. They had pretty much eloped. He was actually married, but he eloped with Mary. And they went to Italy and they met up with Lord Byron and Lord Byron's physician, John Polidori. Lord Byron, by that point, was a famous poet. Percy Shelley was a pretty well-known poet also. Mary and Polidori hadn't really written anything. But while they were there, they read a book. It was actually a German collection of horror stories that had been translated into French, and then later it was also translated into English, but they read it in French. And they decided that they could write stories just as good as the stories in this book. And so they challenged each other to write stories. And Percy Shelley, he didn't actually write anything. Lord Byron started a story that he never finished. It's just like maybe a page or two long. But the other two, Mary and John Polidori, both wrote very famous books. Mary, of course, wrote Frankenstein, and this is pictures of Mary and Percy Shelley. So she wrote Frankenstein, and sadly, a lot of people at the time assumed that Percy Shelley helped her a lot, and because he was a man and she was a woman, and she was only 18 when she wrote it. So, but as far as I know, Mary pretty much did the whole thing herself. I don't think Percy Shelley did a whole lot of the editing. But of course, Frankenstein became incredibly popular. And then this is Polidori. He is on the left, and this is Lord Byron over here. And so Polidori wrote The Vampire, the first vampire novel in English. And everybody assumed, or there were rumors going around, that Lord Byron had actually written it. So when they went to publish it, a lot of the publishers put Lord Byron's name on it to try to make it sell better. He was not real happy about that. And by that point, he and Polidori had a falling out and didn't really like each other anymore. But it became extremely popular, more so in France than in England. In France, immediately it was translated with Lord Byron's name as the author, and there was a sequel written to it by Cyprien Berard, and then there was a play by Charles Nodier, who was like the famous head of the French Romantics at the time. We're talking about 1821. He wrote a play called The Vampire, and then that led to a whole slew of vampire novels and plays in France. Vampires were extremely popular there. They weren't so popular back in England. So there's all this French vampire literature that has pretty much been forgotten and ignored, but in recent years it's starting to be published into English for the first time, which is part of what in my book, Vampire, Grooms, and Spectre Brides, the subtitle is The Marriage of French and British Gothic Literature, and I talk about how the English authors influenced the French authors, and then how the French authors influenced the English authors, and back and forth, and how there really isn't just English and French Gothic, there's just Gothic, and they all influence each other. So I think we have the French to thank for the popularity of the vampire character, really. So all of these people, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, John Polidori, met early deaths. Percy Shelley ended up drowning in a lake. John Polidori, I think he died of consumption, if I remember right. he was only maybe 27. Percy Shelley died at about 30. Lord Byron went off to Greece and to fight in the Greek War of Independence and died there when he was 36. And his death was in 1824. It was the last one. And that left Mary Shelley, the only one of that group who survived. And so she wrote this wonderful novel, which is not as well known as Frankenstein, but which is my favorite of her novels, The Last Man. And it's just a fascinating book. It begins in about the year 2081 and ends in the year 2100. So way in the future, even for us still. It's really the first, Frankenstein's often considered the first science fiction novel, but this is the first science fiction novel really set in the future. And it is about a plague that wipes out the entire human race, which really resonated with me a few years ago when we were living through the pandemic. And the main characters in it are all basically fictional versions of Percy Shelley and Lord Byron and Mary Shelley. And the critics just completely hated it. They thought it was terrible. One of the main characters was the Prince of Wales, who became King of England in the novel. And then he abdicated the throne, and the critics were like, oh my God, that would never, ever, ever, ever happen. Never, ever, ever, ever. But Mary Shelley, she foresaw Edward VIII abdicating. It's kind of fun to read because she wasn't really into like technology, so they're all driving around in their horses and carriages in the year 2081. But it's a fascinating book as the characters all die off, and there's religious fanatics, and the earth is like just kind of like sick of the human race. So they try to cross the English Channel, and the sea is just boiling, and just nature is just all against them completely, the humans. And at the end, only one person is left alive. And this is Lord Byron on his deathbed there in ancient Greece during the Greek Wars of Independence. So now back to those French vampires. So the hero of Polidori's book was Lord Ruthven, and Lord Ruthven was the most famous vampire of all time until Dracula came along. And then everybody has forgotten Lord Ruthven, but he made many appearances in many novels. So like I said, there's the sequel, Cyprien Berard's sequel, Charles Nodier's play, and then a whole bunch of others. The Virgin Vampire, this is the cover of it. That is a novel. Alexander Dumas' The Vampire was a very famous play in its day. And then you have Paul Féval's Vampire City, Captain Vampire, and there's a whole bunch more. I only listed a few of them. But what's really fascinating about these, and I have no proof of this, but it's my theory that Bram Stoker either read some of these French novels or he was familiar in some way with French vampire literature, and that influenced him in writing Dracula. And I say that because in Dracula, the women are, he bites their necks and then they become vampires. And with Mina, the main character, she has not quite become a vampire, but she's able to communicate with Dracula on some level, like telepathically. And a lot of that is happening in these French vampire novels, long before Stoker. And also, it's the development of vampire literature is not necessarily the rules that we know today, such as you get bit in the neck and that's how you become a vampire. In The Virgin Vampire, the main character, she becomes a vampire because she lives in Hungary, and her lover is a soldier in Napoleon's army who comes to Hungary, and they fall in love, and they make a pact. They engage in some sort of pagan wedding ritual, which she takes as a legitimate marriage. And then he leaves her and goes back to France and gets married and has kids, and she becomes a vampire because she's been forsaken by her lover. And then she shows up in France, and she gets her revenge. And in Vampire City by Paul Féval, that one is really fascinating because the main character of that novel is Mrs. Radcliffe, who was so popular in France that, 80 years after the Mysteries of Udolpho, everybody knew who Mrs. Radcliffe was in France. So he has her as the first version of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. She finds out on her wedding day in England that her cousin on the continent was kidnapped by a vampire. So she leaves her fiancé and gets across the channel and meets some friends on the continent, and they go to Vampire City to get the vampire. And it's kind of a comedy parody. It's very funny. He makes a lot of fun of Mrs. Radcliffe and her long descriptions of nature. But the character that is able to actually defeat the vampire is a female who is one of his victims, and she wants her revenge. And that's common in a lot of these vampire novels, is that the woman who was made a vampire by the vampire wants to get the vampire. And that, I think, filters down eventually to Dracula. So meanwhile, in England, the vampires got a slow start, but you have Varney the Vampire in 1846 to 47, which is like about 27 years after Polidori's novel. It takes for another vampire novel to come along. And this is the cover of it, Varney the Vampire. It was actually a penny dreadful, which meant that it came out, it was serialized, and so you could buy it for a penny. And it ran for over a year. I think every week there was an installment, and it had these wonderful illustrations throughout. And Varney is kind of a sympathetic vampire. It starts out being really gory, and like the Feast of Blood, the subtitle. He's out there, biting all these women and sucking their blood. But as the novel goes on, he starts to feel regret. And he wants to basically end his existence. And so the wandering Jew figure ties into that, the immortality as a curse sort of theme. So he does things like he tries to jump into the volcano to kill himself, and the volcano spits him out. And he tries to drown himself in the sea, but nope, the water won't let him drown. And so he's kind of searching for redemption. And then we have Carmela by J.S. Le Fanu, who is she's a female vampire, one of the first female vampires, in English anyway. And then we have Dracula. And then we also have another book that's pretty much forgotten, The Blood of the Vampire by Florence Marryat, who, that one, I'm assuming you guys know Dracula, so I won't say a lot about Dracula. But The Blood of the Vampire, the main character is a female vampire. She doesn't even realize that she's a vampire. She's more like an energy sucker. Like she's around people, and then after they spend time with her, they just feel exhausted and worn out. And eventually a few people die from just being in her presence, and she doesn't realize that she's like sucking the life out of them. And it's also kind of racist because her ancestry is from the West Indies, and one of her ancestors was African and into like voodoo and stuff like that, and so she's cursed as a result. Finally, she comes to realize that she is killing people off. She doesn't want to believe it. She gets a boyfriend. Her boyfriend tries to convince her that it's not true until he dies. And then she realizes, yes, I'm killing people off. And so she has to kill herself, basically, because she's cursed by this ancestral Negro voodoo blood in her. So it's kind of a disturbing book. And it was kind of overshadowed because it came out the same year as Dracula. And of course, once Dracula came out, that was the end-all and be-all of vampire literature for a long time. Meanwhile, we also have this, there's a lot of, I want to talk a little bit about how the Gothic is not just about horror, but how it morphs into all of these other genres of literature. It really becomes like the grandfather of all these forms of literature. And so in the 1840s, the city mysteries genre comes out, which is urban Gothic, and this is the cover of The Mysteries of London by George W.M. Reynolds. It starts out with Eugene Sue's The Mysteries of Paris, and that book is just a phenomenal bestseller, like the biggest bestseller of all time in its day. and it's serialized in the newspapers. So all the local, or all the middle class and the lower class people can afford to buy these papers for a few cents. Whereas books were very expensive at the time. I mean, you'd pay hundreds of dollars for a 3-volume novel in today's money. But these books were really popular because the poorer people could read them. And so The Mysteries of Paris was so popular, all these spin-offs came out. So Paul Féval, the one that wrote Vampire City, also wrote The Mysteries of London. And then George W.M. Reynolds also wrote The Mysteries of London. Féval is French, Reynolds is English, but they both had the same idea. Reynolds may have actually plagiarized in the sense of stealing the idea from Féval. The Quaker City really could have been called The Mysteries of Philadelphia. It's by George Lippard, who was a friend of Edgar Allan Poe. It's the first American city mysteries novel. Then you have The Mysteries of Marseille by Émile Zola, another famous French author. And there's tons of more of them. There's even a film, The Mysteries of Lisbon. It's a foreign film, but you can find it on Amazon Prime. It's like about 4 hours long, based on the Mysteries of Lisbon novel. There was The Mysteries of Buenos Aires, The Mysteries of New Orleans, The Mysteries of this, The Mysteries of that. So there's a ton of them. They are not Gothic in the sense that they have supernatural characters, but they are Gothic in the sense of the atmosphere. And what happened is we went from Gothic castles and convents and medieval settings now to the Gothic happening in the modern city. So The Mysteries of Paris is set in like 1840 at the time it's being written. And they're very much about crime, and the mysteries are largely crime related. The main character of The Mysteries of Paris is Prince Rodolphe, who is disguised as a common everyday laborer in Paris, and he goes around and gets involved with all these kind of seedy characters and tries to reform them, and nobody knows that he's really this prince from Germany. And the same with a lot of the other books. There's all these secret identities. There's a lot of cross-dressing, people pretending to be someone that they're not, and just lots and lots of crime. And out of those, eventually, we'll develop the detective novel. And then over in the United States, these are the main creators of Gothic literature. Charles Brockden Brown, the one on the far end. He starts writing novels in the late 1790s. Ormond, Wieland, Arthur Mervyn, and Edgar Huntley. Edgar Huntley is probably my favorite one, and it is Gothic in the sense that the main character in parts is under fear that the Native Americans are going to get him. He's in this gully or this valley, and he's being chased by the Native Americans, so they become like the monsters in the novel. James Fenimore Cooper took that to a higher level, where he made the American forest the Gothic place rather than the castle. And so the characters are, running through the forest, being chased often by Native Americans, or, maybe the French or whoever the enemy is in the novel. Nathaniel Hawthorne, of course, he goes back to his Puritan ancestors and all of their superstitions, their beliefs in everything, being a sign from God or Satan out to get them. And so he creates a lot of novels based on that, and short stories. So even a book like The Scarlet Letter, which you may not think of as Gothic necessarily, it's full of Gothic themes of redemption and guilt. I mean, Hester has her scarlet A because she's committed a sin, she's committed adultery. Her husband shows up and pretends to be someone else other than her husband, so he's under a fake identity, and he's pretty much terrorizing her by making her feel guilt. And he himself has been held captive by the Indians, the Native Americans, and so he has these sort of this traumatic past, plus he's got a lot of these strange scientific ideas. Rosicrucianism and other ideas like that are part of the plot. I didn't really talk about Rosicrucians, but there was a subcategory of Gothic called the Rosicrucian novel, in which the characters are after the two main treasures of the Rosicrucians. Christian Rosenkreutz supposedly was this character that lived for 100 and some years, and he was able to turn lead into gold. He had the Philosopher's Stone that would turn lead into gold, and the other thing that he had was the elixir of life, which would help make people immortal. And so those were big themes in early Gothic novels, and a lot of that is in not just the Scarlet Letter, but a lot of Hawthorne's later works, like Dr. Grimshaw's Secret, his unfinished novel, has a lot of Rosicrucian themes in it. And then, of course, we have Edgar Allan Poe, and I'm sure you guys have all read at least one Edgar Allan Poe story. And, he's kind of obsessed with death. And think of The Fall of the House of Usher again, the family secrets, and, a haunted house, all of those kinds of things. And because the Gothic really starts out in this medieval feel of this medieval world, or setting, it becomes more historical. So you have Sir Walter Scott on the left there, who is known as the father of the historical novel, best known for Ivanhoe. If you read Ivanhoe, there are all kinds of Gothic elements in Ivanhoe, which you may not think are there, but it starts out with a character who's a wanderer, which is a typical Gothic wanderer character. There's lots of concerns about inheritance in Ivanhoe. And you have Rebecca, who's a Jewess, who consequently plays into the whole wandering Jew idea. And his most Gothic novel, I think, is Anne of Geierstein. That is a real treat to read, in my opinion. Margaret of Anjou is in it, and she's like Mad Margaret in this tower. I mean, like just out of Shakespeare, but a little bit different plot twist. There's a character who is in a bed in a hotel, and suddenly the bed starts sinking down into the ground, and he finds himself in this cavern surrounded by this secret society who kind of read him the riot act about talking about them and how he has to keep them, not say anything about them because they're a secret. And then you have William Harrison Ainsworth, who also writes some Gothic novels and historical novels, and he went around doing what has become known as psychogeography. He'd pick these important historical places and create these novels about them that were very Gothic. So the Tower of London was the first one, and it's if you look at the picture here, you can see they chopped. This is John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. His head, they just chopped his head off. And that picture is very much like the picture of the French Revolution, the king's head being held up. This is about the attempt to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead of Queen Mary I. But it's all set in the Tower of London, and there's all kinds of creepy characters and family secrets and murder and treason and espionage, all kinds of stuff going on. But they're trying to make these books more historical, and it's I would say it's pseudo-historical. It's kind of a stretch. It's a little exaggerated, but it is historical. And then I talked about Varney the Vampire, one of the Penny Dreadfuls. And then later in the Victorian period, we have the Shilling Shockers, which are also, you could buy this story for a shilling. So these are all really popular in their day. Wagner the Werewolf, one of the first werewolf novels. The String of Pearls, which is better known to us today as Sweeney Todd. And here's an illustration from Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. So there were just tons of Penny Dreadfuls going around. And a lot of them you can still find today. And then, like I said, the detective novel develops out of the Gothic, the city mysteries especially. So you have Edgar Allan Poe writing The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is set in Paris and is pretty Gothic also and kind of grim. There's an orangutan running around with a razor killing women. Dickens writes Bleak House, which this is a scene from Bleak House. This is Joe with Inspector Bucket, one of the first detectives in literature. And Joe has been asked if he can identify this woman in this veil, because a woman similar to that has been asking about a dead person and wanting more information about a dead person, and they're trying to find out who she is and what her relation is to the dead person. And then, of course, you have Arthur Conan Doyle, who writes the Sherlock Holmes novels. And so all of that is there would not have been detective fiction if there hadn't been Gothic fiction. And then we come to sensational novels. Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights are not technically sensational novels, but they lead to the sensational novel, as does the City Mysteries novels. This is a picture from the film of the 1939 film of Wuthering Heights. And by sensation, I mean there's something in the novel that shocks people. So, for example, in Jane Eyre, Jane falls in love with Mr. Rochester. Eventually, she agrees to marry him. They get to the altar, and someone shows up and says, wait, they can't get married. Why not? Because Mr. Rochester has a wife. She's the mad woman living in the attic at Thornfield Hall. And then Jane remembers, oh yeah, there was like weird stuff going on up in the attic, and I heard these noises, but I didn't know what it was. Well, it's because it's his mad wife living up there. And so all of these novels, Lady Audley's Secret, The Woman in White, they all have sensational things like that. The Woman in White, there's a sister who's a look-alike to another. She's like a half-sister, and they're kind of look-alikes, and one of them gets put in the insane asylum, and it's confusing who's actually in the insane asylum. So it's all just kind of like the beginning of the soap operas, that kind of stuff. And then also the Gothic becomes the father of the adventure novel. And so you have by the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, the adventure novel being born. You have like Journey to the Center of the Earth and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, where the Gothic is really under the water. You have all these sea monsters down there, and they're attacking the Nautilus. And so it's not super Gothic, but it's enough that it's an adventure story. It's exciting. It's scary. For me, one of the scariest moments is in Journey to the Center of the Earth, when the characters are down in the earth, and they find all this prehistoric stuff, and they see this creature, and then they realize that it's a man, and it's like this creepy, like Neanderthal, and it just creeps them out to think that that's what we are descended from, because this is also the time when evolution is becoming known, and that is also very scary and Gothic to the Victorians, who up to that point thought we were made in man's image, and now there's this other theory that they don't like so much. This picture is a scene from H. Rider Haggard's She. She is the woman in the picture there. She's an immortal being who they find in Africa, who is like all powerful and all scary to them. And she, of course, falls in love with one of the men that come into contact with her. And out of this, especially these later novels, King Solomon's Mine, She, Heart of Darkness, Tarzan of the Apes, you got colonialism and reverse colonialism going on. And so these characters are very much afraid of She, because they tell her all about England, and she's like, oh, I would like to go to England. And they're like, oh my God, what would happen if she came to England? She'd destroy England. And the same thing happened with Dracula. Dracula wants to go to England. And what does he want to do to England? He wants to eat everybody. He wants to suck their blood. And so She is set in Africa, which England is colonizing. Dracula is set in Romania, which was not technically a colony, but was treated as like a third world country, kind of being divided up and fought over by the major powers like Russia, Austria-Hungary, and England. It was known as the breadbasket of Europe. They were getting a lot of their grain from there, so they pretty much were treating it like a colony. And so at the same time, you have a lot of Eastern Europeans migrating to Europe, including Jews. And so there's a lot of anti-Semitism in Dracula. There's a lot of fear of, these foreigners coming into England and changing England. So that's all reverse colonialism going on. And even Tarzan of the Apes, which is written by an American, but about an Englishman, Tarzan ends up being Lord Greystoke. He is raised by apes. He doesn't even know he's human until he finds his parents' cabin that they built before the apes killed them. And he finds his father's manuscript, and he teaches himself how to read because he's an English lord, so of course he's of superior intellect. But he finds this manuscript, and before I said there's always the family secrets and the lost manuscripts. So he finds the manuscript that tells him his past, that he is Lord Greystoke. So even Tarzan has its Gothic elements. And then as we get towards the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, we have the science fiction novels and what are more modern horror novels. So we have War of the Worlds, where the aliens become the monsters. They're the scary ones that are going to come and take over the earth. They're kind of the more up-to-date version of Dracula invading England. We have Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who, besides writing Sherlock Holmes, writes The Lost World, which is set in South America. The characters discover this plateau which has all these prehistoric creatures on it that are not able to get off of the plateau, and no one can get off the plateau, so they've been able to survive. So you have some scary moments where, like Ned Malone, who's the narrator, has like a Tyrannosaurus after him, stuff like that. And then we have H.P. Lovecraft, who, in some ways, I think his are the creepiest because I think he only wrote like one actual book and just kept telling the same story over and over in different ways. But a lot of the time, his characters have these they discover these things about their ancestors, and their ancestors turn out to have been like amphibians living in the sea. And so they have this screwy bloodline in them that creeps them out. Or there are these ancient creatures that lived on Earth before there were humans, and they've been sleeping under the earth, and now it's time for them to come back and take over the earth. And so the humans are all, terrified by this possibility. And then finally we have the Gothic merging into the superhero. And so think about, you have like the Wandering Jew who is helping people out. He's immortal. He's helping people. You have more realistic characters like Jean Valjean in Les Miserables, who is a convict, but at the same time a really good guy. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he is of incredible physical strength. And then you have someone like the Phantom of the Opera, who is a villain, but he's misunderstood. And he has a mask. And then he soon morphs into people like Zorro, the Lone Ranger, the Phantom. The Phantom is the first superhero to actually have like a superhero costume. And then, of course, you get Superman and Batman. And Superman is an alien from another planet. So that kind of relates to the science fiction aspect. Batman, of course, a lot of critics have written about Batman's connection to Dracula and the whole bat idea. So, and of course Tarzan, like I said, was really a superhero too, one of the first superheroes. And then as the 20th century goes on, we get more and more of this sort of sympathetic Gothic characters. So you get these sympathetic vampires like Anne Rice's Lestat, and Stephanie Meyer's Twilight, where the vampires are, practically sex symbols. They're all attractive and sympathetic, and, women want to be in love with the vampire. So, and it just continues on today. It's very common to rewrite the old stories and try to put new spins on them and maybe develop the characters more. Even Dracula, the last 10 years was the movie Dracula Untold, which told Dracula's backstory to try to give us more dimension to the characters. So that is basically it. If you want to learn more about Gothic literature, you can go to my website, gothicwanderer.com. I have a blog. I write articles all the time about different Gothic novels and Gothic films.
Attention patrons, the Peter White
And
Public Library is closing in 13 minutes at 8:30.
and those are
We are
some of the
in 13 minutes.
Gothic books I've written. The first one there, The Gothic Wanderer from Transgression to Redemption, is mostly about British Gothic literature and the Gothic Wanderer figure. And it covers from the Mysteries of Udolpho up to Twilight, basically. And then my newest one, Vampire Grooms and Spectre Brides, like I said, it's about the marriage of French and British, and my argument that there really isn't just French and British Gothic. You have to look at both of them because they were constantly reading each other and influencing each other. We know Bram Stoker knew French. He could at least read French, if not speak French, which is one reason I think he probably read a lot of these French vampire works. And then this book, I only wrote an essay, an introductory essay for it, but this is Powers of Darkness by Bram Stoker. And it's fascinating because for years we knew that Bram Stoker had written the introduction to the Icelandic version of Dracula. And scholars never really quite understood how it was that people in Iceland got Bram Stoker to write this introduction to Dracula when he didn't write introductions to any other country's version of Dracula. Well, it turns out that the introduction was largely plagiarized from another author, and someone finally read the version of Dracula they have in Iceland, which was in Icelandic, and they discovered that it was a radically different story than the Dracula we have in English. And then they started trying to figure out why this was. Was it that Bram Stoker had rewritten the book and sent it to Iceland to be published? Or did someone in Iceland just decide to rewrite the book themselves? And then they discovered that the version in Iceland was actually an abridged version of the Swedish version of Dracula. And so now the Swedish Dracula has been translated into English. And so I wrote one of the essays for that one. And, you know, nobody is really sure yet if Bram Stoker wrote it or someone in Sweden wrote it. I tend to think there's things about it that Bram Stoker left a lot of notes for Dracula, and there are notes that did not end up in Dracula. Like, for example, Dracula has a female housekeeper in the notes, but not in the novel. But in this novel, there is a female housekeeper. So how do you explain that? Is it just a fluke that the Swedish author rewrote Dracula and put in a housekeeper, or did he have access to Stoker's notes? So it's really fascinating. Honestly, it's very different than Dracula, but I think it's as good as Dracula. It's just a very different story. So, and this one is only available as an ebook, but then somebody else also translated it, and there's a paper version also, but I don't have an essay in the paper one. So that is it. Does anybody have any questions?
Did Bram Stoker ever write another book besides Dracula?
Oh, he wrote many books.
Okay.
And probably the best one he wrote other than Dracula was The Jewel of the Seven Stars, and it's a mummy novel. And there has at least been one or two film versions made out of that. He also wrote one called Lair of the White Worm, which has a film version with Hugh Grant in it. It's a terrible movie. It's a very strange book. They think that Stoker had some sort of fear of women, and this gets into his fear of women in the novel. He wrote Lady Athlin, which is a terrible book. He wrote The Lady of the Shroud, which is also set in the Carpathian Mountains like Dracula was. He really, honestly, he was not a good writer other than Dracula, and he spent about 7 years writing Dracula. So I think he wrote and rewrote and rewrote until he got it right. And H.P. Lovecraft actually claimed that he met a woman who at one point Bram Stoker thought of hiring as his typist, and she told him that the manuscript was a mess when she saw it. So You know, I even wonder if he had some ghostwriting helping him, because his other books are not very good. They're readable, but they're not fabulous by any means. But he wrote about maybe 8 or 10 novels altogether. Yeah. Yes, Larry.
You got Gothic art, Gothic architecture, and Gothic literature. What's the common denominators at the time period that they evolved from?
Well, Gothic architecture really comes first, and we're talking, like the 1200s with the Gothic cathedrals. The rest, the Gothic art, like the painting of the Nightmare, and then the Gothic novels are really, late 1700s, early 1800s, and they're trying to pull back onto that medieval Gothic atmosphere. So they're later, but they're all related. They're trying to copy that. It's kind of like, for example, the Victorian period, you have the pre-Raphaelite artists, and they were doing all sort of medieval paintings, like lots of King Arthur and sometimes more classical stuff. But they were trying to go back and recreate the art of the artists before Raphael in the Renaissance. And so the Gothic is kind of doing the same thing, going back and trying to create the Gothic feel or the Gothic atmosphere that would have existed in the Middle Ages. But then as time goes by, it becomes more like urban and more modernized. Does that answer your question? Okay. Right, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for coming. You're a great audience. I hope you learned something.